Okay, I think we better get started here. So our first speaker of the afternoon will be speaking online. It's Hilding Neilson, and he will be speaking on Indigenous knowledges and kinship as a model for our future in outer space. So please welcome Hilding.
The peoples and the Mi'kmaq peoples, and it's on a memorial. Today is an important day. This weekend was National Day for Treatment Reconciliation Canada, all orange shirt day, so I'm wearing my orange shirt to commemorate the lives of people of the community who died and survived the war schools in Canada. I want to talk to you about kinship and issues about how we talk in space, but this isn't really a community engagement talk. I'm more thinking about this through the policy lens of how we can, as the IAU, think about how we advocate for space and its usage. In that way, we also have to acknowledge, as astronomers, that we benefit from historical and ongoing colonialism, whether it is telescopes being built around the world, whether it is naming conventions for celestial objects, and whether it's land-grant universities and so on. We benefit in so many ways from colonization. So when we talk about Indigenous rights and how we need to be engaging with Indigenous peoples with respect to outer space, we have to realize we're playing both sides of the coin here. That sometimes we impose colonialism, sometimes we want to use it for our advantage. Likewise, this is the Artemis Accords and the discussion of sustainability is also having a colonial lens. You know, the Artemis Accords is largely designed to be a methodology for exploitation in space, but also sustainability is, in a way, also colonial. If you live anywhere in Canada, much of the US, you'll see how sustainability becomes a linchpin for imposing environmentally dodgy impacts on Indigenous communities, whether it's Standing Rock, West Sowetan, the Ring of Fire in Northern Ontario, and so on. And so we have to be also aware of all these things. We have to position ourselves as a community and understand where we're coming from. But largely for this talk, I want to note that Indigenous peoples have been on, I say this land, but this land being Canada, United States, Australia, New Zealand, and so on, since time immemorial. Their territories are their homes for tens of thousands of years at least. And in that respect, peoples have lived with nature, the animals, the water, and the air for that long, learning and becoming kin with those beings. Similarly, that means a deep connection with the night sky. Observing stars changing over time, whether it is Indigenous Australians' observations of Betelgeuse and its variability, or as well as Anishinaabe in Ontario, noting the same thing. There is a deep and sensitive connection to the night sky. That is a relationship that is ongoing. That relationship occurs in many ways. That relationship can be cultural. That relationship can be spiritual. For many Indigenous peoples, including my own the Mi'kmaq, the stars are our ancestors. It's scientific, whether it's navigation or learning about motions of the stars and predictions, or economic relationships even. And those relationships occur with space and celestial objects. And this statement is crucial because the United Nations Declarations for the Rights of Indigenous Peoples notes that Indigenous peoples have rights to their territories, with their cultural, scientific, and economic relationships.
Make me a co-host, is that possible?
And as such, sorry, someone's talking right now online. That means that spiritual and scientific and economic relationships with space and celestial objects.
Is it recording at least?
Well, I'm sorry, there's some people talking in my ears.
So sorry, Connie, I think your window is not muted. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So when we have these discussions, these are important because that means Indigenous peoples have that relation with space. And the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples also means that that relationship does not have to be on territories where there are literal footprints. So whether it's Hawaii or Eritrea or wherever, the territory is not necessarily the land or water where they absolutely have evidence of walking. So part of that territorial rights includes space, includes the moon, includes Mars. And therefore, under UNDRIP, any policy about space must include and incorporate Indigenous rights and Indigenous methodologies. That is something more than we've ever thought about in space. The Outer Space Treaty doesn't do this. Artemis doesn't really do this. The recent Ashta Carta kind of points at this kind of idea of indigenous peoples. But overall, we have historically excluded Indigenous peoples from policymaking about outer space. And the reason this is important with Indigenous methodologies is because Indigenous methods are very different from traditional Western science. Now, there's no pan-Indigenous methodology, but there are many commonalities. This has been underwritten by many scholars, Marie Batiste, Gregory Cajete, Daniel Laipe, and more. And, in terms of outer space in our discussion today, I think what's most important is this idea that nature is familial. Traditionally, when we talk about nature in a Western system, nature is a hierarchy where humans are the apex. And in fact, almost all of our discussions about outer space is about how humans will interact with each other in space, or how humans will benefit from working in space, whether it's satellites or in person with mining, etc. But this idea of nature as being familial changes the methodology significantly. And we can see this relationality, for instance, in the Mi'kmaq cosmology of 6 worlds. This is in this cosmology, the Mi'kmaq acknowledge that there are more worlds in play than have been traditionally noted. So we have the world we live on, the land. We have the world in the water. We have the world underground. We have the world in the air. We have the world above the clouds. And the world above the clouds being space means that is a distinct, not ecosystem, but territory that exists beyond us. And for us to go there means we have to consider various protocols and relationality. For instance, when Indigenous peoples in Canada travel between lands, we acknowledge we're guests on that land, and we propose to act as good guests and treat our hosts with respect, whether the hosts are other nations or animals or water. So in the same way, this Mi'kmaq cosmology means when we go to space, we have to treat it with respect and as a guest, not as a user, not as a human right, but only as a guest. And this Mi'kmaq cosmology is not unique. In the social handbook of space, outer space, which I'm mangling the title, there are a number of authors who talk about Anishinaabe cosmologies, various Indigenous Australian cosmologies that all relate to the same thing about being a guest in space. That means these cosmologies recognize that space is both animate and we live in treaty. Now, treaty is a bit of a hard word in this context because we talk about treaty, outer space treaty, or treaties between nations, but treaties are also between First Nations, Indigenous peoples and land, Indigenous peoples and animals, Indigenous peoples and water, and so on. And so we have to live in treaty with respect to space. And that treaty isn't about our rights, though there's a little bit of that. It's also about our responsibilities, what we do in space to be good kin and good guests. So when we do that, we have to consider all the different methodologies in play. So based on that methodology, we have to consider what that means. What does it mean to live in treaty with outer space? Currently, the Outer Space Treaty, Lunar Treaty, the Artemis Accords, they outline the rights and responsibilities for human interaction with each other in space. They also outline the rights to exploit outer space, whether it is the Outer Space Treaty, which is exploitation for the benefit of all humankind, or the Artemis Accords, which is a very, very much a corporatist methodology for exploitation of outer space. But none of this actually outlines the responsibilities in outer space, to outer space. So we have to ask, if we're going to include indigenous methodologies, what would be the rights of outer space? Not what rights do we give. I mean, there's a whole legal precedent about giving various rights, whether it's human rights or other rights, but not what rights do we acknowledge? What rights do we support? Because outer space has the rights. It's just whether or not we support them or we choose not to. And if that's the case, what are our responsibilities in space? Not just to each other as nation states or as corporations or as whatever, but what are our responsibilities to space? And I mean, I understand this is a very hard question for many people, you know, and it may be a hard question for anyone to answer. But I'm also reminded of a book by Sheila Kote-Meek, who an Inuit scholar who wrote a book called The Right to be Cold. Now, I'm sitting here in Newfoundland, it's 10 degrees. I don't like being cold. I would kind of wish I was in Canary Islands where I'm sure it's warmer. But, you know, the idea of the right to be cold is a right inherent to the land. And that's also a right inherent to the people. So what maybe space has a right to be space, whether that means a near vacuum or means to be unimposed. And so in that respect, if we go to space and use space, then what do we get back? If we put a satellite in space, we're taking away part of that identity of outer space, of that so-called environment. So what do we get back to support that environment? What are we trading when we extract as two treaty-going beings, whether it's humans in space, as humans in space, what do we get back in trade? So I think I ran a little quick in my talk, but hopefully that helps everyone catch up a little bit in time. I think it really matters is, well, how does our relationship with outer space change if we acknowledge the inherent rights of space? And I don't mean giving human rights, and I don't mean giving human, guardianship over space. I just mean inherent rights. And if humans are expected to give back and respect the rights of outer space, then how do we operate? Currently, we are in a methodology that seeks to exploit, both from the side of astronomers, because astronomers do exploit. We take photons away, we use them. That exploitation may seem rather trivial, but it is an exploitation. Or whether it's corporate, which is satellites in space, or corporate as in lunar space stations and lunar exploitation. How do we go about that? Do we have a free hand in exploitation space? Currently, we think we do because we treat space as inherently nothing and anatural, as was noted in the previous talk, as not having any human or life in it. And that treatment of no life is problematic because that allows us to destroy, decimate, and delegitimize the rights of space. And I think as an astronomical community, whether as those who work from the ground with telescopes, theoretical like myself, people who love JWST, what are the impacts and responsibilities of the astronomical community in engaging in space? Because when we do the same thing, we take not just from space, but our telescopes take from land, take from indigenous peoples. So we can't, if we wish to have an anti-colonial framework for operating in outer space, we also need to have an anti-colonial framework for operating on Earth. So I hope this idea of a different policy methodology that treats space as familial, as kin, perhaps offers us a new way forward that moves beyond simple exploitation versus sustainability, and allows us to maybe be more inclusive of all peoples on Earth, including sovereign indigenous nations. So with that, I'll thank you, and Walalia.
Recording stopped.
I don't know if there are any questions, but
Recording in progress.
I would love to have a conversation with you all, if possible.
Well, Hilding, hi, this is Nick Campion, the next speaker. I'd just like to really commend your views on adopting an anti-colonial perspective, because I think not only does this mean anti-colonial, it also means adopting a critical approach, and whatever a dominant narrative is, identifying alternative narratives. So just, thank you for clarifying those perspectives.
No, thank you for your kind words. I see Fiona has a hand up. I think, sorry if I mispronounced your name.
Fine, it's got GH, it's silent. Can you hear me? I've got new earphones on. So thanks for your
Yes.
talk. I'm sort of an ecologist and sort of an anthropologist. Come to me called environmental, and now works in space science and astrophysics. And I'm a bit concerned that people are using rhetoric from environmental studies for space that to me is inherently colonial, whatever you're doing, really. I realise that's quite a controversial statement, and that often some of the activities, they're kind of softened by using environmental terms or using the word sustainability. And they're misused in the environmental field anyway. So I hear a lot of this, the repetition, but the repetition is unaware of where it's come from, which often is colonial itself. So I am really interested in this topic. I do start from the point of view that anything, space environmentalism for me, I'd say is actually quite colonial, a lot of the discussions. And it's not that we shouldn't do it, it's just that maybe we should take off our rose-tinted glasses and begin to say, well, I think it's all anthropocentric, almost all of it. And it's kind of like, well, do we have more acceptable forms of anthropocentric nature? I mean, I spent years, my PhD is about land and land rights. I did work with indigenous groups in forestry. So I kind of want to throw that out, that we do have to be careful that we're not reusing certain terms in environmental fields that in themselves are problematic. But thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.